Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. The last few days we've been talking about the story of lumbering and how lumbering and all of its aspects affected the growth of Pensacola, bringing it from a waterfront, hardly a village in post-World War and post-Civil War days, up to a major city and a major port. And in the past episodes, we've talked about how a demand from Europe began to fuel the need for lumber in this area. And of course, we talked about the fact that Pensacola had been sort of the waterfront hub of a 125 square mile area of virgin yellow pine, which was the perfect resource for making lumber available to the needs in Europe. And we talked a little about how some of the experienced people with capital and know-how in the lumbering business came to Pensacola, and by the time we got into the mid-1870s, they were putting together lumbering mills up and down the rivers, to the west, to the north, places such as Bruton, Muskogee, Millview. All of these became areas of interest in lumbering. And of course, as all of this happened, people began to make money. At the same time, we had new railroads arriving here. In 1870, the Pensacola and Louisville was completed. 3 years later, a small line over to Millview was put in place. In 1881-82, the Pensacola Atlantic gave us service to the east. And as we came to the early part of the 20th century, another group of adventurers led by people like Henry McLaughlin and Roy McGargle put together the Pensacola, Alabama, and Tennessee Railroad, which ultimately had several different names, different adventures, and ultimately in the 1920s was absorbed into the Frisco system. All of this was taking place. Things were going extremely well, and it's well here for us to mention just a few of the other names that became involved, because some of the great names of our time were certainly in that era. Number one that we must never forget was William Dudley Chipley. Chipley had come here in the 1870s to be the general manager of the Pensacola and Louisville area railroad as it was being expanded, and it was Chipley who led the way in the building of the Pensacola and Atlantic. Chipley became not only a railroad man, he had a vision. William Chipley was certain that the United States was going to spearhead the digging of a canal across Nicaragua, which would connect the Atlantic and the Pacific and make Pensacola the ideal port for shipments going to the west side of Latin America, and of course also across the Pacific. Chipley had this vision, and because he did, he was able to get the railroad to expend considerable money in putting in place great docks and warehouses and so forth right along the waterfront at the foot of Commandencia and Barrack Street. It was Chipley also who had the foresight to recognize that steam power was going to replace sail on the water. And so as we get into the 1880s and early 1890s, Chipley recognized that the vessels coming here, more and more were coming here that were steam powered. They had to have a good source of coal. And so he, working with the railroad, arranged a system to bring in coal from the coal fields of Alabama down here. And then the first big thing that they did from this, the railroad did from this, was to build a track from the railroad freight yard on Alkany Street at about 9th Avenue, build it straight on an angle down to the waterfront, and it became what became known as the Muskogee Coal Tipple, Coal Wharf. In the 21st century, that, of course, the wharf is long gone, but now real estate developers have now developed it into a first-class area for home construction, residential construction, and work as well along there. But as one drives by on the Bayfront Parkway, look out at there, and you can, at the far end, you can still see where the anchor position of that coal tipple was. It was so large that it could handle 6 vessels at one time, loading coal either as bunkers or for shipment overseas. Now, going beyond that, we have to remember other families that came here. One of the biggest ones, of course, was the Rosasco family. The Rosascos came here basically as friends of the Perotis. The Perotis had the Bay Point Mill. The Rosascos developed into a family of shippers. They were exporters because they had wonderful contacts in Italy, which was a country that had not been contacted well in the beginning of the lumbering era. The Rosascos developed a wonderful system. They put together their own shipping company, at one time had as many as 6 vessels that were going back and forth all the time. They were very community-minded, and in 1905, when the Perodis were ready to retire, the Rosascos purchased the Bay Point Mill, and it became known as the Rosasco operation, and they were the ones, of course, that ran the village there as well. They had one little side story about them that is sort of interesting. The Rosascos loved to party. And so once they had beautiful steamships coming back and forth, once a year they held a giant party on board ship. The vessel would come in here and it would be decorated with lanterns and all sorts of other beautiful things. They would serve fine Italian wine, wonderful food, and they invited all of the power structure to come on board for an evening of entertainment. And there are still people, a few people around in Pensacola who still remember having been invited to one of those affairs. And they said that one group of people that really knew how to entertain was the Rosascos. Of course, they continued on in their business once their forests were gone. They continued on in the real estate business, which is still a part of the family interest today. Others that we want to mention, of course, are the Blunts, the Robinsons, the Millers, the Fauchys, the Perodis, the Rosascos, the Wrights. All of these were families that either came here with the lumbering era or happened to be lucky enough to be here and be able to take advantage of the coming of the lumbering period itself. Now, the Wright family was typical of that. The Wrights, the original Wright settler here was Benjamin Drake Wright, who arrived here as a newspaperman and an attorney in the early 1820s. He was the owner of the Pensacola Gazette. He was so prominent that he sat in the Constitutional Convention when Florida became a state. And his sons, after the war, his sons opened a lumber industry here with their father's help, and the Wright Lumber Company down on the waterfront was one of the larger ones for a long time. Now, in addition to that group, of course, we want to mention some who came here and made financial news and history as well. We were going to talk about banking in a subsequent episode, but I want to be sure that listeners looking at the period of the lumbering times will recognize that we had started out with the Brent Bank. We had opened the First National. We had merged the Brent and the First National. Then the Citizen National had come along. The Merchants Bank had come along, and then a little bit later on in 1900, the American National Bank was opened. They operated first out of the Opera House, strangely enough, and in 1910. They were the organization that built the 11-story tower that we today call the Seville Tower. They built it as the anchor for their national bank. They operated the first 2 stories, and the rest, of course, was professional people. They sort of set a standard, and they built what they claimed, of course, rightly so, they claimed was the largest building, the tallest building in all of Pennsylvania, all of the state of Florida at that time. So they were very proud of it, and they continued on to be a part of the story for a long time. Well, now, as we move toward the end, things happened that were good. All through the early part of the 20th century, the lumbering industry continued. Downtown Pensacola was improved. The city, finally, after a long operating out of second-rate facilities, in 1905, they sold bonds, and that enabled them to build, for the first time, they built a police department and jail on the corner of Jefferson and Main. And 3 years later, they opened a new city hall. After the Civil War, the city had operated for over 40 years in a rented office on top of a meat market on South Palafox. Very primitive, but now they spent money and built a beautiful Spanish-style building on the corner of Jefferson and Intendencia. And of course, the city used that for over 80 years. That is today the T. Wentworth Jr. Historical Museum. Beautiful arrangement, and this was all part of the growth of Pensacola. Along this same period, Christian Thiessen, a man who had made his money operating a bar, decided he wanted to do something that was nice for this community, and I think he was pressured a little bit by his wife on this too, because she didn't care for the stigma of being a bar owner's wife. So Thiessen invested his money in a 5-story building on the corner of Chase and Romana and Palafox, and the Thiessen building was put into being, and it's still a showplace in downtown Pensacola today. In the same period, the 2 of the lumbering people who had made money in lumbering, Bingham and Malden, put together their resources, put together a company, and they built a first-class hotel. The San Carlos Hotel came into being and opened its doors for the Mardi Gras in February of 1910. So all of these little pieces were coming together. People were doing well, making money. Another group was planning still another railroad that was going to go from Pensacola toward Mobile and New Orleans. They were sure that we were going to make that connection, and they did get started, and it went about 30 miles before they unfortunately ran out of money. But then things began to go the wrong way. In 1913, a small new bank had been opened on the corner of Palafox and Garden Street, the Bank of Pensacola, had made an unwise loan to a group of younger investors who wanted to buy up cut over lumber timbering properties and convert them into sales to people up north. This was an era when that sort of thing was going very well in Central and South Florida, and they reasoned they could do it well here. They got their $100,000 loan, began work, and then we went into the financial panic of late 1913. The bank needed its money back, and of course the investors could not pay, and the bank failed. And when it failed, of course, many of the merchants down along Palafox and Garden Street lost because there was no deposit insurance at that time. 6 months later, an almost identical thing happened. The First National Bank, of course, was the big stalwart bank of the city, and Francis Brent was its president. And one morning he received a cable. And the cable said that the banking house of Crow Rudolph in Liverpool, which was the conduit for transactions back and forth, banking transactions in lumbering between Pensacola and Eastern England, the Crow Rudolph had failed. They owed the First National Bank about $500,000, which was, that time was a huge sum. Well, Brent wasn't particularly worried. He had about $400,000 in gold in the bank. However, the federal charterers had to come in, make an inspection, and the man who did that inspection, a man named, unfortunately for history, his name was Goodhart, he declared that the bank must close, and it did. And as that happened, the losses along Palafox and Garden among the merchants were tremendous. Well, Mr. Brent, to his great credit, went about the next 2 months selling as many of his private interests as he could so that he could use that money to try and pay back his depositors as he was able. And he worked himself almost, well, literally to death. One noon he went home for lunch. He told his wife he wasn't feeling well, he was going to lie down for a minute, and he never got up. 3 days later, they held Brent's funeral. And it was a grand affair. The service was in St. Michael's, and then the burial was in the St. Michael's Cemetery. And the preacher had an opportunity. He had a huge audience there, and it was raining, it was cold, but he knew he had an audience the like of which he wasn't likely to get again for some time. He went on and on, but he finally ended. And at that point, the 6 pallbearers allowed that they would go back to the new hotel, dry off, have a cup of coffee. And as they did, they sat around and they got a little maudlin. And one man said, "Oh, isn't this terrible? We've lost Brent. We've lost the other bank. We've lost all those deposits. The people in the commerce are just suffering." Another man said, "Yeah, I've just been out there on a timber cruise." "Well, you know, we've been cutting timber here for over 40 years. The trees there aren't all that many left." And a third man said, "Yeah, have you been reading the paper? Why, they could be at war in England and in Europe almost any day. What will happen to our lumbering trade if that happens?" Well, these men departed. They were depressed. Well, I marked that date for you because it was April of 1914. And from that day until 1963, only one building of greater than 2 stories was erected in all of downtown Pensacola, and it was a WPA federal courthouse. We began a 50-year period in which the entire area was on a kind of a flat curve economically. Things just did not happen because from 1914 on, the lumbering era was slowly but surely, year by year, slowing down. And by the time we reached the middle 1920s, lumbering had all but ended. We had enjoyed a wonderful run from 1870 to the mid-1920s. Fortunes had been made, all new ancillary business had been decided, the city had grown, its culture was in place, new housing developments had begun, we had railroads in position, and yet from 1925 forward, things were going to be slow. But we'll pick some of that up and what happened in later episodes of our story.